want to welcome you back to another study on the book of Romans. Today we're in chapter 11, and we'll be looking at verses 11 to 24 together. So let's take a look at our passage. Paul has just been talking about how God has preserved for himself a remnant chosen by grace, and he has hardened the larger portion of Israel, Israel of the flesh, but Israel of the promise in Paul's day are those who have received the gospel, who have believed in Jesus Christ as Jewish people, and they are ones who have been sovereignly chosen and sovereignly called and sovereignly preserved for God himself. Paul is still continuing to address this question of God's perceived rejection of Israel as a whole, and he's been arguing that that's not what God has done, that all the way along there have been two Israels, Israel of the flesh and Israel of the promise, and Israel of the flesh has been hardened, and they reject God's purposes for them, and they are the ones who are rejected. And there are times in Israel's history where Israel of the flesh is in the vast majority, and there's only a remnant that God has preserved for himself all the way along. And Paul's applied that to his present context, that even though the vast majority of Jewish people, even in Paul's own day, are rejecting the gospel and even treating the gospel with hostility and refusing to believe in Jesus, there is still that sliver of Jewish people who've become Christians, who've received the gospel, just like the Apostle Paul has, and they represent that remnant chosen by God's grace. And so Paul continues to address this question in our passage today. And here he asks the question in verse 11, "So I ask, did they stumble in order that they may fall?" And here he is talking about the larger portion of Israel, of the Jewish people. So have they stumbled beyond recovery? That's what how the NIV puts it. Did they stumble so hard that they've fallen away and there's no way that they can come back? And so Paul says, by no means. Rather, through their trespass, and the trespass is the rejection of the gospel, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous, or as the King James puts it, to provoke Israel to jealousy. And so what Paul is pointing to here is that God has a purpose in doing this, that through the rejection of the gospel by the Jewish people, by and large, that has given the opportunity for the Gentiles to hear the gospel. Because, at least from an earthly perspective, if all the Jews were believing the gospel, then there might not be much opportunity for the gospel then to go over to the Gentiles. But in the rejection of the gospel by the Jewish people, by and large, then the opportunity has gone to the Gentiles to receive the gospel. And Paul says that one of the purposes of this is to provoke envy or jealousy in the nation of Israel, as they see the Gentiles being blessed and the Gentiles having a relationship with God, and God opening salvation up to everyone. So verse 12 continues, and Paul says here, "Now if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean?" And so Paul says if the majority of the Jewish people have rejected the gospel, and that's their trespass, and that has resulted in wonderful spiritual riches for the world at large, and if the Jews have stumbled and failed in rejecting Jesus, and that means riches for the Gentiles, they've had this wonderful benefit of salvation opened up to them, Paul says, how much more will their full inclusion mean? So what greater wealth of riches, spiritually speaking, would be poured out and lavished upon the world if God brought back that larger majority of Jewish people into the faith? Verse 13, "Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry," or I glorify my ministry, "in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them." So Paul is intimating here that jealousy is sometimes a way of shaking the Jewish people up, that as they see God working in the hearts and minds of Gentiles, Paul is using that jealousy that the Jews would feel in order to have opportunities to share the gospel with them and to shake them up and to challenge their own preconceptions about God and about true religion. And thus, maybe some of them may respond and turn to the gospel and be saved. And so Paul is informing his majority Gentile audience of this part of his ministry, that his heart is for his fellow people. As he said back in chapter 9, he has great and unceasing anguish and sorrow because of his kinsmen in the flesh, his fellow Israelites. But he is saying that even though his apostolic calling is for the Gentiles, he still has a heart for the Jewish people. And so he will even use his ministry to the Gentiles in order to provoke jealousy in the Jewish heart, to challenge them and open their eyes to the gospel so that some of them may be saved. Verse 15, Paul reiterates what he said back in verse 12. He says, "For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead?" And so Paul is hinting at one of the signs of the coming resurrection of the dead is this turning to the gospel amongst the majority of Jewish people. Verse 16, "If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches." So Paul is saying, even if the larger majority of Israel has been temporarily rejected, there's still an aspect of holiness to it because of its root, because it was once a part of the dough. So Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians are the first fruits, and that is holy. But because it comes from that larger lump, there's a certain consecration or holiness to it. And we should probably say it's a holiness with a small h, not a capital H. It's not as though the larger portion of Israel who has rejected God and rejected the gospel are holy to God in a sense of righteousness, but it's in a sense of God's purposes, that there's still a special aspect to them according to his calling. Verse 17, Paul is using an agricultural analogy here. He's talking about an olive tree. He says, verse 17, "But some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you." So this can be a little bit complicated, but what Paul is saying here is that the olive tree represents Israel. And some of the branches of this olive tree, which is Israel, have been broken off. So they've been rejected by God. And the picture in our minds, it's hard to equate with what Paul has been saying at large. But if we try to do it, we have to imagine, let's say, an olive tree that has 100 branches. And Paul is basically saying that 99 of those branches have been cut off. And so really there's only one branch left on that olive tree. But that's still enough to keep the olive tree going. So it's a very thin olive tree at this point because it's a remnant chosen by grace. The vast majority of Jewish people are rejecting the gospel in Paul's day. But he says Gentiles, represented by this wild olive shoot, they have been grafted into this olive tree. So now this olive tree has one Jewish branch and let's say 99 Gentile branches. So it's still, though, Paul says, it's still, though, sharing from the root. It's being nourished by the root, which is a Jewish root. So even though the Gentile branches are in the majority now, it is still a Jewish root that nourishes the entire olive tree. And so verse 18 says, "Do not be arrogant," because Paul's talking to mainly Gentiles in this letter, as he said back in verse 13. He's saying to the Gentiles, as wild olive shoot branches now, "Do not be arrogant toward the branches." And what I believe he means there is to the remaining branches, which in my analogy is that one remnant branch. So don't think of yourselves, just because you're in the majority, that you are somehow better than your fellow Jewish Christians. Because you have to remember, Gentiles, that's not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Because the remnant is the natural olive branch. The Gentiles are the wild olive branch that have been grafted in to true Israel. The Gentiles have been grafted in to Israel of the promise. Verse 19, then you will say, but branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. So that might be a cause for arrogance. Well, 99 of those olive branches were cut off to make space for us so that we could be part of it. So that must make us pretty special. Paul says, verse 20, that is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, their rejection of the gospel. But you stand fast through faith because you have accepted the gospel. So do not become proud, but rather fear. Verse 21, for if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. And what Paul implies there is neither will he spare you if you also go towards unbelief and you begin to reject the gospel. Because the nourishing root is the gospel. It's always been that way, ever since the Garden of Eden. This olive branch, represented by Israel, is really nourished by the gospel, as God has nourished this gospel root all the way along, through Noah, and through Enoch before him, and through Seth before him, and then through Abraham, and then through the covenant of Abraham and the patriarchs, and then Moses through the law at Mount Sinai, and then the judges and the prophets and the kings. It's a gospel root that is at the center of all this. So when the large portion of Israel, that is Israel of the flesh, rejects that gospel root, they are broken off. But that allows the opportunity for wild olive branches, the Gentiles, to be grafted in to Israel. But Israel now, Israel of the promise, is still nourished by that gospel root. And so if these wild olive branches discontinue their connection to that gospel root, that connection to Israel of the promise, they will also be broken off. And so Paul says, do not become proud or arrogant over the remnant of Jewish believers in Christ, that natural olive branch that remains. Don't become arrogant over them. Don't be proud, but rather fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Verse 22, note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, meaning the Gentiles, provided you continue in his kindness, otherwise you too will be cut off. But conversely, Paul says in verse 23, and even they, meaning the broken off branches, the unbelieving Jewish people, even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, or continue in their rejection of the gospel, their rejection of Jesus Christ, they will be grafted back in, for God has the power to graft them in again. Verse 24, for if you are cut out from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own native olive tree? And so Paul's saying, if God was able to transplant you, a wild olive branch, an uncultivated olive tree, contrary to nature, God was the divine gardener who chopped you off from your idolatrous, sinful, Gentile, uncultivated olive tree and then grafted you in now to a cultivated gospel olive tree, Israel of the promise. If God can do that transplanting, that garden grafting, how much more would he be able by his sovereign power to bring those broken branches, the natural olive branches that have been broken off through lack of faith in the gospel in Christ, and graft them back into their own natural olive tree. And so that is what Paul has been saying. So his warning to the Gentiles is not to be arrogant over their fellow Jewish Christians, but rather to realize that they have been grafted in by faith in the gospel, and they only stay grafted in as long as they maintain their faith in the gospel as well. And that's true even of the remnant of Jewish people. They will be broken off as well if they reject the gospel, like the other Jewish people, Israel of the flesh. And so this is how Paul continues to answer this question of whether or not God has rejected Israel as a whole. And the answer is no. He has rejected the unfaithful branches. They have been broken off, but there still remains a faithful remnant to God among the Jewish people. And this space on the olive tree, as it were, that has been opened up, has now been filled by a Gentile majority. But again, the Gentiles are not to be arrogant over that Jewish remnant, because it's a Jewish gospel root that nourishes the entire olive tree. And if God is able to take idolatrous Gentiles and transform their hearts and bring them into Israel of the promise, he is more than able to do the same with the natural branches that have been broken off. He is more than able to bring apostate Israel back into right relationship with himself through faith in Jesus Christ.